So my critical pedagogy story has probably three primary parts. One has to do with where I was born. The second has to do with my role as a faculty member. And the third has to do with using dialogue in my work. So let me start with where I was born. So I was born in Ghana, West Africa. It's about 3 years old when my parents immigrated to the United States. This story is really important for me because I think a lot about the notion of being an immigrant, which is the identity that's really salient to me given coming from Ghana to the United States. And I vividly remember my dad as a child when I was about 6 years old. He would always say to my brother and me, you have to work twice as hard as your white peers to achieve similar success in life. And I didn't really understand what that meant until much later in life. And looking back on it, it was probably my first earliest memory of that there is injustice in the world. And that because of who I am, how I look, how I identify, that it means people are going to make assumptions about who I am, that they're going to think I'm not good enough, that they're going to look at my race and think that's the most important piece of who I am, and that ultimately they're going to make judgments based on that. And so for me, that mantra stuck with me in the sense that I have to consistently be attuned to how people see me, how they see my racial identity. And for my dad saying that, it ultimately meant because of my skin color, I'm going to be discriminated against. And so that part informs my story, my critical pedagogy story, because it's a reminder constantly of having to pay attention to how I show up in the world, how my identity looks to people, which ultimately connects to the second part of my story, which is around being a faculty member. So as a faculty member in my position, I have tremendous power. My voice is accorded a certain level of respect. People hear what I say. I hold a position of power in society in ways that other people don't. And so even though sometimes because of my racial identity, I feel that I'm discriminated against, also as a faculty member, there's a certain level of power that I have. And I recognize that, and it informs the way that I work with students. So I really try to mitigate the power imbalances that exist between myself and students. And that means I share parts of myself, I share my story. I invite students to also share their stories because we're constantly trying to be attuned to power, but also trying to break down those power imbalances. So that's one aspect of critical pedagogy too, is thinking about the notion of power. Some of my colleagues of color prefer that their students call them by doctor, because again, in their mindset, they've worked hard to earn that degree, and there are so many ways in which people of color are not accorded respect in our society that for them, having students use their first name means that they're diminishing that respect that they feel that they deserve. So I understand that. For me personally, however, I use my first name because I want to deconstruct and break down those power balances, because ultimately this leads to the third part of my critical pedagogy story, which is around dialogues. So for me, like, dialogues is really thinking about issues of power, trying to break down the power, trying to connect with people across differences. It really intersects all of the pieces that I've talked about so far. So by sharing my story about my being an immigrant and my parents and thinking about that mantra that my dad said to me, I can start to engage in dialogues with people who share my story and with people who are different from me. And I ultimately believe that that dialogue is only possible when we are aware of the power differences that exist and try to break them down. So that's why I use dialogue as a tool to connect across differences. And ultimately, that's three pieces of who I am when it comes to my critical pedagogy story. So for me, critical pedagogy is around trying to teach in a way that helps students become critical thinkers, examine the world, see their stories, and use that as a means to connect across differences. So for me today, I started out by sharing my story about where I was born, talked about my role as a faculty member and trying to break down power imbalances, and then finally ended with using dialogue as a way to engage across differences. And I hope those three pieces helps you understand a little bit more about who I am.